In 1859, America and Britain nearly went to war with each other, all over the unceremonious execution of a pig. I spent way too much time on this topic, so now I'm wasting yours. In 1846, the Oregon Treaty was signed by the US and the UK. If you don't know what that means, and why would you? In short, the US and British North America got so sick of dealing with each other's crap that they drew a line from the Rocky Mountains to the western sea border and said,
"Don't cross this line!"
However, the man the U.S. government selected to negotiate the border was at the time Secretary of State James Buchanan. Does that name sound familiar? Because if you keep following me, it will. James and the British envoy Richard Pickenham, in all their infinite wisdom, forgot that islands exist and didn't bother to specify who got to keep the islands of San Juan. The treaty states that the border in the Strait of Juan de Fuca would follow the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver Island. You know what's also in the middle of said strait? A bunch of islands. So the treaty that set out to end the border dispute between the US and the UK just made it smaller. Thanks to the excellent border making of drawing a line in one direction and then taking a hard left turn, America and Britain had no idea who actually had custody of San Juan. And no, the people of San Juan did not get 2 Christmases. Yet. In the following years, the two sides set up a commission to settle some border disputes that had been created over this treaty, but neither side could agree what southerly and navigable meant. It's comforting to know that our politicians are following in the footsteps of their predecessors.
Reporting the nomination.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not completed.
I'm sorry. How much more time do you need?
5 to 10 minutes. As I said, I wanted to talk.
With no verdict reached, the land was still disputed, so people from both countries came and began to settle. The British Hudson Bay Company built a sheep company on the main isle of San Juan, and roughly 25 to 30 American settlers arrived and started putting down roots. You might ask yourself, why were both sides unable to make a decision on who got the islands? It's the same reason we spend more on our military than the next 9 countries combined. Simply put, but what if we need to fight each other? America didn't want to give it up because the British had a fort on the much larger neighboring island of Vancouver, giving them a lot of control over the strait. If they also had the San Juan Isles, they'd control all the local straits. This obviously made the British pretty competitive on keeping it. The tension over ownership of the Isles came to a head due to an incident on June 15th, 1859, on the island of San Juan. An American farmer named Lehman Cutler discovered a pig in his garden ravaging his tubers? The pig was eating gross potatoes. Cutler, having dealt with the pig several times before and wanting to protect his garden, promptly shot the trespassing swine. What he didn't know was that the pig was owned by an Irishman named Charles Griffin, working for the Hudson Bay Company as a tender for their company's sheep. Apparently, Griffin had several pigs that he allowed to roam free around the island, which makes sense to let your grazing animals free range on an island with no natural predators until you remember that you don't have full claim on the entire island. Upon learning of the pig's death, Griffin was pissed. For some reason, Cutler argued that the pig was eating his tubers, and thus he was justified to defend his crops. Griffin's reply to this was, "I kid you not. It's up to you to keep your potatoes out of my pig." Which, different time period, I understand. This was pretty much the frontier. But that is the most Karen response I have ever heard in a historical context. Cutler not wanting to escalate the situation, offered to pay $10 for the pig, which is roughly a little less than 400 in modern monopoly money. As someone who has some experience with agriculture, that's a pretty small amount for a pig in the modern day. But apparently back then they would buy heads of full-grown pigs for $1 to $3, which is about 120 in the modern day. Either way, $400 for a pig that was trespassing and eating another person's garden is fairly reasonable, I would argue. However, reasonable isn't why we're here. Griffin did not agree to this deal. He actually wanted 10 times what Lehman was willing to pay, which is $100 or almost $4,000 in our currency for a pig that was trespassing. So obviously Cutler refused, but the British took Griffin's side and demanded that he pay that or be arrested. So Cutler, who was a citizen of America, not Britain, fled the Isles and made his way into the mainland Washington territory and makes his way north towards the Vancouver Fort, which is a fort along a river bordering Oregon and Washington. Being a true American, he was going to use the only social program Americans can get. He asked the U.S. military for help. Now, if you remember from earlier, the moron who negotiated the Oregon Treaty, James Buchanan, well, he somehow convinced a populace to make him president by this time. I'm sure this will have no repercussions on future events. Anyway, James, a few months prior, had appointed General William S. Harney to be the military leader of the Oregon Territory. This also covered the Washington Territory, I believe. Harney was known for being incredibly ruthless, especially with the native populace that he had fought in years prior, particularly ambushing them during parleys with American forces. So probably not the hero of our story. Harney was the commander who got word of the pig conflict and decided to take decisive action, immediately taking steps to de-escalate the situation and restore harmony to the island. Nah, he decided he wanted to annex it. Captain George Pickett was sent with 66 men and a warship to the island with the mission of protecting American interests and to lay claim to the islands themselves. The British, catching word of a warship approaching their border, sent 3 warships in response. So an issue that could have been handled by 2 people working out a reasonable price for a possibly wrongfully killed pig became an armed standoff that could become a war at any time. At first, the Americans placed the base of operations near the British-owned Hudson Bay Company, the sheep farm that I mentioned earlier. I'm no tactician, but wouldn't you want to place your troops not near an enemy asset that you don't have a reason to threaten? Oh yeah. By the way, they also didn't realize that they had placed their operations in range of one of the British warships. Within a day or so, they realized that they were compromised and moved back a few miles to a hill and reestablished a base camp. Pickett realized quickly that the British had mobilized a much larger force, and he sent for reinforcements. So General Harney at this point realized that he is in way over his head. So he finally decides to send for negotiations and get this settled away. Nah, I'm kidding. He sent more men. Lieutenant Colonel Silas Casey arrived under a fog with 170 men shortly after receiving word and taking control of the situation. Casey is genuinely the only commander in this situation who is even remotely trying to de-escalate anything. By the time he arrived, Captain Pickett had been giving speeches about Bunker Hill fighting and dying in a blaze of glory. Lieutenant Casey was not a fan of that idea. Instead, he approached one of the warships and asked for parley to come to a peaceful resolution. At this point, though, the British were a bit bitter about Harney and Pickett's aggressive actions and refused. This negotiation attempt wasn't a complete loss, though, as Casey got a good look at one of the warships and also managed to threaten them. He pretty much said, should my men fall, 300,000 angry Americans would replace them. Which is a bold statement. This was probably a bluff, as America would probably be in hot water if they entered another war, with the Civil War tensions building. But it was enough to make the British think twice if they did try to attack. When Casey returned to camp, he immediately sent word for even more men in light of the warship capabilities, and also ordered to move the camp again, stating that Pickett's position was too exposed. He's got a habit of that, it seems like. They moved to yet another hill and began building a major fortification to withstand the siege if it came to it. By August 10th, the American forces had grown from 66 men to about 460 men with 14 cannons, which you would think would give them a good foothold on the small island, until you look across the potential battlefield at the 2,100 British troops with their 70 cannons mounted on 5 warships. It's safe to say the Americans were at a slight disadvantage. While Pickett and his men, to Casey's dismay, were openly willing to fight and die for the gross potatoes, the British were somewhat hesitant to start another war with the Americans over a walking slab of meat. That was no longer walking, but, you know. The governor of Vancouver, the British island hosting the British Army, ordered that his forces clear out the Americans, preferably without violence. However, the captain tasked with the job refused, at least until he was reinforced by Rear Admiral Robert L. Baines, which, when translated, more or less just means I'm not paid enough. When Admiral Baines arrived, he takes one look at the American army and realized how committed they are to this mission, and said something along the line of, I don't want to fight the Americans over a pig, and refused to take military action. So at least somebody was a little bit sane. It wasn't until September 1859 that word arrived to President Buchanan about the conflict that had begun almost 2 months prior. Buchanan was surprised to hear that the war criminal he had appointed to run Oregon was making bad decisions. Being too busy politely asking the South not to break up with him, Buchanan dispatched General-in-Chief of the Army Winfield Scott to resolve the issue. Scott was best known for likely having OCD. When it came to military regulation and uniforms, he was reportedly extremely strict and particular, which earned him the nickname Old Fuss and Feathers. You thought I was going to say he was best known for being fat. General Scott sailed to Fort Vancouver in October of 1859. When he arrived, General Scott grilled Harney for his escalation of the pig fatality, and pretty much grounded him for the remaining duration of his military command of Oregon. After this, Scott arrived at San Juan Island and opened up negotiations with the British. He ended Harney's claim of the island, and the two sides opened up again and agreed to hold joint custody of the region. This time with limited military occupation. 100 soldiers of each army would remain to keep the peace, and all others would withdraw. After negotiations, General Scott returned to Fort Vancouver and promptly relieved General Harney, reassigning him to St. Louis in Missouri, so Buchanan could watch him closer. And so if the Civil War did break out, the Union would already have an insane war crime enabling general on the front line. Of course, this didn't work out well, as Lincoln fired him 2 months into taking office because of a whole other poorly handled situation. On San Juan Island, the garrison troops would become very friendly. The conflict shifted from war escalation to competition as to which side could throw better holiday parties. The biggest threat to retaining the peace at this point was just the abundance of alcohol drank on the island during this period. In the end, the islanders did get their 2 Christmases. Get it? From the start of the video? In 1871, 12 years after the initial conflict, America and Britain finally signed the Treaty of Washington, which set out to finally resolve the border dispute at San Juan, as well as a handful of other border disputes that they hadn't resolved the last time they did this. The terms of the agreement called for a neutral arbitrator to decide which nation's proposal would be adopted. So German Emperor Wilhelm I was selected. Yeah, you didn't think Germany would be in this video, did you? You might be wondering though, what happened to Lehman Cutler? He stayed on San Juan for a while before moving to the mainland Washington territory. He died in 1872, and having no family nearby, most of his assets were sold for the money and sent back to his family in Michigan. Interestingly, the shotgun used to kill the pig was one of the items sold at this state auction for $14. And Captain George Pickett, the guy who led the initial American force, became a war criminal, just like his grand general. He joined the Confederacy and hung 22 North Carolinians as deserters, even though they weren't. So that was the Pig War of 1859. A conflict of way too many wrong peoples there at the wrong times. From Buchanan sucking at every job he's ever had, to Harney really just wanting to kill people, it was a ride. If Lieutenant Casey and Admiral Baines hadn't exercised restraint, our map could look a lot different right now. If America could have even survived a war with Britain at that point. But in the end, the pig never received its justice. And I think that's the real tragedy.